Okay, so it is now recording. Okay, so before this event officially starts, I would like to honor the land acknowledgement. So MSP would like to acknowledge that we gather in the traditional land of all these tribes. So I would like to take a 30-second moment of silence before we start. Thank you. And now I would like to present tonight's event. It is called Being Non-Binary and a Parent. Do Children Say Mom or Dad? And our tonight's speaker is Andrea Bennett. Today is February 3rd, 2021, and this event is going to be lasting from 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. My name is Erin Longsuiter, and I am the graduate assistant for the LGBTQ Student Resource Center here at the Office of Multicultural Services and Programs. I'd like to thank everyone tonight for coming. This is my first event of the semester, and I am very excited. So please let me introduce again our guest tonight, Andrea Bennett.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. I have set this up kind of in a lecture format, but we're not a huge group. We're kind of a smaller group. So if you have any questions, or, it can be a little bit flexible if you have things to share as I'm talking, because I'm coming to you as a writer and an editor and an essayist, and not an authority on I'm just a non-binary person. I'm not an authority on non-binariness. So yes, so my name is Andrea Bennett. I'm a non-binary writer, editor, and illustrator living in Powell River, British Columbia in Canada on the West Coast. I'll share a few images as I give the talk also, and I'm going to test that out now to see how it works for you all. So what I am sharing, yes. So this is me and this is my kid at the park in Powell River playing with the digger thing last winter when we were still allowed to see people. So Powell River is on the traditional territory of the Tla'amin people, and it's located about 2 ferries north of Vancouver, British Columbia. I am a white settler, and my family has only been in Canada actually for a generation or 2. I live with my partner and my toddler and my cat in a small house with a big garden. I'm the author of 1 poetry collection, 2 travel guides, and an essay collection called Like a Boy But Not a Boy, which is subtitled Navigating Life, Mental Health, and Parenthood Outside the Gender Binary. The mental health part of that is that I'm bipolar 2 and I have generalized anxiety disorder, which is not uncommon for trans people and LGBTQ people in general. So that gives a bit of a sense of who I am as a non-binary person, or a person who is non-binary and also a bunch of other things. I'm going to share my screen again. So this is the cover of my book. It's meant to sort of look like water and like milk, because I talk a bit about, well, I have 2 essays about milk in the book, about nursing, chest feeding. And so that gives a bit of a sense of who I am as a non-binary person. And here's an outline of what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to start off with a sort of primer on non-binary identity. It may be more familiar to some of you than others. I'll talk about non-binary pronouns, gender expression, kinship terms, being a non-binary parent, school and healthcare related things, intersectional identities, and further reading and listening. And at the end, Erin is going to be giving away a copy of my book. So there's a trivia question at the end that is just going to be something that I mentioned in the talk. So um, there are two, just in case the first one is it shouldn't be tricky. You're all students. You're familiar with this type of thing. Okay, so I'll stop sharing again. So I'll start off with just a brief primer on what non-binary identity is, and I'm going to do that through a little bit of personal biography. Um, at the beginning of my intro, I said I was the author of a poetry collection. That collection is called Canoodlers, and I wrote it as I was figuring out my gender identity between 2009 to 2012, while I was doing a Master of Fine Arts of Creative Writing at the University of British Columbia. It came out in 2014. It's important to say that a lot of people at that time were already familiar with non-binary identity and the spectrum of trans identities. And it's also important to say that the concept of a third gender and transness has existed for a long time in many cultures, including in some First Nations cultures on the territories on which we all reside. The term two-spirit, for example, is a term used by some Indigenous peoples. It's an umbrella term. It was adopted in 1990 at the third annual Intertribal Native American First Nations Gay and Lesbian American Conference, long title, which was held in Winnipeg, Manitoba. And two-spirit is meant to represent Indigenous people whose identities might be understood in settler culture as trans, gender variant, gay, lesbian, and or bisexual. Different nations have their own terms for LGBTQ plus identities that they've recognized for long, long periods of time. Other nations don't have those particular roots as part of their culture. Anyways, just all that to say, what was new to me was not new to others. I grew up in a small town. I always had a lot of queer friends, even from a young age. We seemed to sort of gravitate towards each other before we even began to understand things about ourselves. I understood from an early age that I sort of felt a bit different, and that the gender assigned at birth for me didn't feel like the best fit. I wanted more flexibility for my gender expression than what was offered. So, for example, I wanted to be able to play hockey, to wear different clothing, to create an identity that ultimately wasn't very feminine. And some people who feel like that when they're younger, they're cisgender women or young butch women. Some are young trans men, some are young non-binary people. Gender is a complex thing. So I fit into that non-binary category, but I didn't have the language to describe it. I learned that language later, after Canoodlers came out, actually. Basically just after I published that book. And I have non-binary friends who are younger than me, and I have non-binary friends who are in their 60s. And for those of us, I'm 36, and for those of us who are a little bit older, oftentimes we all had a moment where we learned about non-binary identity and something just clicked into place for us, sort of something that felt like a lifelong search or journey. So non-binary is an umbrella term, and it generally refers to people who don't identify as a woman or as a man, but instead feel like some combination of the two, or neither of the two, or something wholly different entirely. And I'll talk about this a little bit more later in the sort of gender expression part of the talk, but non-binary people don't look any particular way. We might have a gender expression that's more masculine or more feminine or a mix. And some people are gender fluid, meaning they present one way one day and another way another day. Most non-binary people identify as trans. I do, some don't. And non-binary people may choose to take hormones, they may choose to have gender affirming surgeries, or they may not. And then it's also important to say there are people who don't identify as non-binary who may be gender non-conforming. Those are two different things. So feminine men or masculine women who do identify with the gender they've been assigned at birth, but they express their gender in ways that are different than how we're socialized to expect people to express their gender. Um, so it's to a large extent, gender identity is somewhat of an interior thing. It's the way that we feel inside ourselves and the way that we see ourselves that is the most important marker when it comes to identifying as non-binary or trans or not. Um, and one final thing, it's also important to say that gender identity more broadly and non-binary identity more specifically are different from sexual orientation. So a non-binary person can be attracted to men, women, non-binary people, some combination thereof. Um, yeah, so that is my general primer on non-binary identity. I will now segue into talking about pronouns. So as I mentioned, I'm 36. And when I learned to conjugate verbs in elementary school in the 90s in Ontario, a small town in Ontario, the conjugation table was set up in two columns. So on the singular side, it was I, you, he / she. And on the plural side, we, you, they. And we were taught that they was used when we were speaking about a group of people, and anyone singular received he or she. And if we were writing something that described a hypothetical single person and we didn't know their gender, the feminist way to handle this, in order to not rely on using a masculine neutral, which was the standard before that, was to write S/HE or he / she. But even then, outside of class and written English and bad television, we were already using the singular they regularly as a pronoun when we talked about a person whose gender we didn't know. It came naturally because, and which makes sense because they has actually been employed as a singular gender neutral pronoun in English since the 14th century. They is even regularly employed by people who are skeptical about the existence of non-binary people. And I'm sorry for mentioning him, but like Jordan Peterson, I have to apologize on behalf of Canada for exporting him from our country. So I'll give you an example of what I mean. In a retail situation, for example, if a customer comes into the store and they look confused, you should approach them and ask them if they need help. This is the type of sentence that is really normal for most English as a first language people to use, even people who don't believe in non-binary people. And of course, the reason that people like Jordan Peterson have a problem with the singular they, it's not actually a grammatical reason. It's rather that it feels affirming for non-binary people to use that pronoun, and he'd prefer the entirety of the English language and everybody in the world conform to the categorizations with which he's personally comfortable. But anyway, so they and them are common pronouns for non-binary people to use. Non-binary people can also use he, him, and she, her, and sie, their, and er. And I think I'm going to try sharing my screen again. I believe I made a little, oops, I did not. Okay, I thought I did. I'm sorry. I do have kinship terms later. Zizer is like you can use a Z or an X for Zizer. That one is a little bit more popular. I don't know, I'd say maybe 5 years ago, but it's still in use. And air, which is basically, or am, it's they, them, but minus the th. Some people do use that. And some people use a mixture because they're comfortable, for example, with both she and he, or she and they, or he and they, for example. And so two great ways to affirm non-binary people are to practice using their pronouns correctly, and when writing a gender neutral text, to favor they over she, he. And if someone transitions and you need to switch the pronouns you've been using, I highly recommend practicing in private. And you can do this too when a trans friend changes their name so it aligns better with their gender. It takes a little while sometimes to make this shift, and so practicing helps. Um, I did something similar actually in a different context when my childhood best friend got married and she changed her last name. It was hard at first for me to think of her with her new last name, but I wanted to show her that I respected her decision and supported her choice. So I would repeat her full name, her new full name, to myself while I was on a walk or doing the dishes until it became the new normal to me. And then also, if you accidentally misgender someone, just say a quick sorry, correct yourself, and move on. Don't over apologize or make a big deal of it. And then the other thing, um, that earlier stuff is sort of like 101. This is sort of like the 201 thing. You can check in with your trans friend or loved one to see what you could do to be helpful spreading the word if they want. So this is a super personal thing. It might not be safe for all trans people to come out, so you have to check first. But if someone does feel safe coming out, you could ask them, hey, is there anything you'd like me to tell people about your name or pronoun change? When someone who doesn't know about the change like uses your old pronoun or your dead name, would it be helpful for me to correct them and explain? Are there people you prefer me not to tell? Again, this is really personal. It's something I personally find helpful. Um, I think, all LGBTQ people know this. But when you come out, you don't just come out one time. You come out many, many times over your life. So for me, if a friend can tell another mutual friend, do a little bit of that work for me, I find it very helpful. Um, yeah, it saves me doing it, or it saves me doing it the first time anyway. So that is my segment on pronouns, and I will move into gender expression now. I wonder if I should ask, does anyone have any questions so far? Comments? Okay, I will proceed. So gender expression. As I mentioned before, non-binary people can embody a variety of different gender expressions. There is a bit of a stereotype that all non-binary people are young and white and thin and androgynous, and that's not true. There are lots of masculine and feminine and thin and fat and older and younger non-binary people. There are African American non-binary people, indigenous non-binary people, Asian non-binary people, mixed race non-binary people. Just whatever type of person you can imagine. There are non-binary people are everywhere. What is true is that, like a lot of things, thinness and whiteness and a sort of semi-masculinity has been favored in mainstream representations of non-binary people. And I check a couple of those stereotypical boxes. I'm not really young and I'm not really thin, but I am white and masculine-ish. But I feel like it's important to say, like, what makes me feel happy and free as a non-binary person is to see a variety of gender expressions and people encompassed under that umbrella term non-binary. Non-binary people with beards and braids and beads, or a buzz cut and a full face of makeup. And just to sort of, someone I follow on Twitter, AW Pete, who is a non-binary physics professor, created a graphic that kind of shows the possibilities for non-binary gender expression. So I'm going to share their graphic. So this is their graphic. And you can see, like, so the pink is representing femme, and oh, am I sharing it? No, I haven't yet. Sorry. There we go. So the pink represents femme and the blue represents the mask, and the white is neither. This is just the colors of the trans flag. Some people have critiques about them. I'm not going to dive into the critiques, but being like blue, white, and pink, you can probably guess what they are for yourself. But these are all different representations that Pete has made to show what gender expression can mean for a non-binary person. So they're all valid gender expressions. Someone could be fully neither with some femme, neither with some masc, half and half. There we go. And I follow a bunch of different non-binary people on Instagram and Twitter. And I find it really cool to see what everyone is up to. I'm a bit of a boring person. I'm a writer. So I lead like an interior life that's not very designed to be on display for people outside. So I favor just like a mushroom cut and overalls. Overalls are common fashion trend for non-binary people. That's partially a joke, but I did actually write a whole article about how non-binary people love overalls. And in the States, you recently had your first non-binary and Muslim. Oh, I always get senators and Congress people confused. I'm not sure. Maureen Turner was just elected, and in their one of their inaugural photos, they're wearing overalls, Carhartts. Anyway, but I did speak with people non-binary people for that article, who experience dysphoria around their chests, and overalls feel more comfortable for them because there's sort of an added layer of protection there, and maybe they skip binding that day. Yeah. Does everyone know what gender dysphoria means? I will explain just quickly, but it's going to be familiar to some of you. So gender dysphoria can arise when your gender expression, or the way you're perceived in the world or see yourself in the mirror, differs from your gender identity. Some non-binary people take hormones or have gender affirming surgeries to help with dysphoria. And then the flip side of dysphoria is gender euphoria. So gender euphoria is the feeling that trans folks get when they feel their gender expression and gender identity are aligning, maybe in a way that's new to them, or maybe they just feel good that day. Hair is sitting the way they want to, voice sounds nice and low or high the way we want it to. And so overalls are a clothing item that lets me feel comfortable in my own skin, which is nice. Yes, but the main point is that there are lots of different ways to be non-binary and lots of different kinds of gender expression that non-binary people embody. Okay, so I will move on to kinship terms and being a non-binary parent. I've written a few times now about being a non-binary parent. And one of the weirdest things that I found happened when I had a kid, when you become a parent, is that your relationship with people in the outside world that you don't really know when you're with your kid is often mediated through your relationship with your kid. It happens also if you're walking a dog, so that people speak to the kid or the dog, knowing the parent will answer. So the address in that situation is a bit funny. It's like, is daddy taking you to the park? Will mommy give you a treat today? And in general, I find that a bit strange. But when I'm with my kid, I get misgendered a lot. I get called mommy often a lot when I'm with my kid in public. And it's a bit jarring because it often happens in the same types of spaces where I am gender checked if I'm using the women's bathroom. So anyway, I find it a bit confusing. And it also has an impact on my relationship with my kid in a way. My partner and I share parenting duties. I went back to full-time work when my kid was 5 months old. I'd been pregnant. I'd been the gestational parent. And when I went back to work, I pumped milk at work so my partner could feed our kid from bottles. But when I think about mainstream media messaging and social messaging about caring relationships and parent-child relationships, the burden of care and nurturing so often falls on a mom figure that actually doesn't exist in my household. And this is something I find sexist, but I also think it has this weird effect of creating a weird imaginary gap in my household and in lots of other queer households. even in a two-mom household, that family structure is rarely represented, and it doesn't fit cleanly into the mainstream narrative of a sort of like neat, clean 1950s derived division of labor between mom and dad. So as parents, we've tried really hard to buy books that have family structures more like ours. There's still a lot of mom in the books. There are a few dads, but there are a lot of moms. I'd love to see more non-binary representation in kids' books, and just kids' books that exist for families in the 21st century. Um, and I also think that the stubbornness of upholding this family structure as an ideal, it holds heterosexual couples with kids back as well. I think we've seen this also during the coronavirus pandemic. Labor force participation has fallen for women in a way that it hasn't for men, for example. There are social and economic pressures to choose traditional family structures, even though it might not be the thing that works best for any given family. And for some families, it's just not possible, not desirable in any way, shape, or form. Um, so, as a non-binary parent, um, with the strength of these historical and social pressures bearing down on my interactions as a parent with the outside world, people don't always know how to classify me, and that makes them uncomfortable. And I think that that's what leads to the misgendering. And I get misgendered far more in parental context than I get misgendered in working context, where I have established an identity that is independent from my kid and my family structure. So uh, those are a lot of thoughts to share about those issues, but that is sort of how I think about it. Um, and there are obvious sort of solutions for when you meet people out in the world, basically just not assuming someone's gender, um, and not talking about someone in the third person when they're in front of you. I think it's probably a good rule, a good life rule. I'm just gonna take a sip of tea because I don't know how to project very well. So I always run out of voice when I'm giving lectures. So next I want to talk a bit about kinship terms. So English isn't as gendered as other languages. My second language is French, for example, and nouns and adjectives, everything's gendered. Um, and earlier waves of feminism began tackling gendered issues in French several decades ago now. So there's been some groundwork laid, um, and work done to render job related titles, for example, gender neutral, like firefighter instead of fireman, or saying you need a few extra hands to staff a table rather than man a table. The safest thing one can do to be inclusive of non-binary people is to use gender neutral language. As we discussed above, non-binary is a catch-all term, and non-binary people favor a range of different gender expressions and terms. So once you know someone well, you might learn that they like certain gender terms. As someone who's a bit masculine of center, for example, and I like puns, it's nice for me when a friend like ribs me for a bad dad joke. And I've taken up embroidery lately. And so the way I talk about that is like, I've decided to become an embroidery bro. Anyway, so you might have a friend who enjoys a bit of a feminine description from time to time. It's pretty personal, and like gender can be fluid and playful. But I do think that defaulting to gender neutral terminology when you don't know someone or just in general is always a good, safe starting point. And then in terms of kinship terms, now that my kid is in preschool, especially, I think a lot about kinship terms and what kinship terms work for non-binary people. My kid calls me and my partner by our first names. We talk about how she has two parents who love her. We describe different family structures, and describe where we fit in terms of like those types of family structures. We have books that describe them. But when people incessantly call me mom, and when the language we use to talk about families societally isn't inclusive, it does make my kid feel a bit left out. And there's only so much we can do within our own homes, um, without any sort of societal change. There's lots we can do in our own homes, and they can be like sort of hopefully safe places for ourselves. But anyway, um, kinship terms are often the way we express our relationships with loved ones to outsiders, people outside our family. They're my cousin, he's my dad, she's my nana, and they're influenced by our cultures. So I'm going to share in a second, on the screen, some kind of like standard North American ones. But you'll notice, for example, I didn't include nana. And your culture may have terms I'm not using here. So the replacements I'm suggesting might not work for you. It's just a starting point. Your culture may already have other neutral terms, or maybe you'll develop a few, because some of them are neologisms. They're new terms that people have created to sort of address the issue of kinship terms. Oops. Oh yeah, here we go. So there's, for grandma and grandpa, you can use grandparent. For granddaughter and grandson, you can use grandkid. Mom and dad is harder. So parent is what I'll use in like bureaucratic uh, situations, like when I'm taking my kid to preschool, having lines to fill out that say like parent rather than mom or dad is helpful. Other people use baba or bapa. Uh, for daughter and son, kid or child. And uncle is their neologisms. So uncle or unkie, uncie. Niece and nephew is nibbling, which is like sibling, which I didn't put on here. Brother, sister, sibling. Ugh. Cousin, cousin. That one's easy. For wife or husband, it's spouse or partner. Boyfriend, girlfriend, spouse or partner. Um, Birthing, pregnant mother, you can use gestational parent or pregnant person. And then for breastfeeding, chest feeding, or nursing. And I'm happy to share these images as a PDF later, Erin, if you like. So when it came to my family, I opted against Baba because it means dad in some cultures and it means grandma in others. And as a white person of English descent, it just didn't feel quite right to me. I didn't want to accidentally culturally appropriate a term. I do like Anki though, and I can live with nibbling, even though it makes me think about eating really tiny sandwiches. um, but it is like sibling and it's cute. And my kid goes to French school, so I have done some research about French resources for inclusive kinship terms and gendered language workarounds. And if your home language isn't English, chances are that trans and queer people have been working on these same types of inclusive kinship terms and gender neutral language fixes in your home languages. And there are probably good resources out there. And what I would suggest for like parents and or for teachers and like prenatal class instructors and nurses and OBGYNs, what I always hope to see um, is basically just like mixing gender neutral language into courses and resources. So, for example, when a prenatal instructor is talking about breastfeeding, mention at the outset that it's called chest feeding often for trans dads and other non-binary parents, and then just say chest feeding and nursing sometimes, kind of to acknowledge that you might have someone in the room that doesn't that for whom breastfeeding is not a great term, doesn't suit their situation. And then for a nurse or OBGYN dealing directly with pregnant people, when I was pregnant, I basically just wish that I had been given an option to tell anyone how I identified. It was assumed. And I was also pregnant in Quebec, so I was navigating the healthcare system in my second language. And as I mentioned before, I was navigating it as a bipolar person, and there are particular concerns around pregnancy for bipolar people. And to me, and I've written about this, it was just too much to also come out And so I decided to exist for those 9 months, just being uncomfortable every time I had an appointment. And it was unpleasant, but it didn't feel safe to come out because I did need to ask for extra support around mental health. Um, and yeah, I mean, I think that the largest fear for a, a parent, for a pregnant person, is the idea that someone might take your kid away. Um, I wanted to, I don't know, as a it was a bit of a high pressure time, but come across sort of like as normal and trustworthy and whatever as possible so that that would not happen. Anyway, if my OBGYN or my nurse or anyone had just given me the option and made it a safe space to do so, I would have happily told them, I'm non binary. Can you please refer to me in XYZ way? That would have made things so much easier. Things are changing. I have hope for the future. But yeah. So, school and healthcare. Um, so, um, over a year ago, school and healthcare, I'm just going to tell some like personal anecdotes, and we can talk more about them afterwards if we want. But so I'll just start. I should say at the beginning, she ended up being fine. But over a year ago, before the pandemic started, my partner and my toddler and I were eating dinner at the dinner table. My toddler was in her high chair. And normally dinner is sort of highlight of her day. She's pretty food oriented and I like to cook. Um, but that day she kind of got a glazed look in her eyes and she was staring into space and not eating and her face was flushed. And we took her temperature and she was just burning up and did not respond to Tylenol. So long story short, we took her to the ER. And the ER intake included specifying our relationships to her, and the form wasn't gender neutral. And we had two options: choose mom or choose dad. And I was sort of trying to figure out what to do. And as I was figuring out what to do, my poor kid threw up all over the floor. And so we were sort of ushered into a private room. And I was like, call me mom, I guess. But it's just like, okay, we have to prioritize how our kid is feeling. So that's one anecdote. Another anecdote, 2 weeks ago when we were picking her up from preschool, the ECE person said like, oh, there's your maman. I said French. And my kid did not know who she was talking about. And even as like I give lectures about this stuff in an interpersonal context where I don't know how someone feels about queer people, and it's a context in which my kid has to exist more than I have to exist. I just froze up. And I just kind of got out of there as soon as I could. And I had marked down and written an explanation on our preschool sign up form, explaining our family structure. And after that moment, I did actually write like a long email offering resources about non binary identity in both English and French. Um, and and I've talked to the one of the teachers like since then. Um, but it is another tricky situation where it would just be nice if people didn't make assumptions about our family structures. That one is ongoing. I'll let you know how it works out. But yeah, in terms of that, needing to come out about 872 million times in one's life. So in moments like these, I feel a really strange mix of sort of vulnerable and demanding, because I don't know if it's safe for me to say, I'm non binary, I'm trans, I'm her parent, please don't call me mom. On one hand, those are four very easy sentences. And I think that it's good for parents to model asserting our needs and explaining who we are. But then there's this little voice in my head that says that doing so in a situation that is supposed to be about my kid, it centers myself in a situation that is supposed to be my kid. I don't want to take up so much space. But if I don't, my kid will wonder what's up. And even though she has parents who love her and care for her, she may end up feeling like she's missing something. If there's always a sort of mother who is existing as a ghost of cultural expectation. Um, and I also think about, if I was pregnant again, would I do that same thing again? Or would I find a voice to say, uh, actually, can we take a moment to talk about culturally competent care for LGBTQ parents? Um, when I was in that situation, I found myself doing a sort of simultaneous translation in my head. I would replace the language they were using with the language that suited me. And I also think about bringing myself forward in these situations and doing those explanations so that I can make space for others who are following me. And sometimes I find the courage to do that, and sometimes I don't. Um, yeah. I think probably too, it's important for me to say that pregnancy and chest feeding are different for every non binary person. And so some non binary people who could be a gestational parent and could chest feed a kid feel comfortable doing so. And for some, they're not interested because the experience feels like it would be too dysphoric. And then some folks just don't want to be parents. So it's a moot point anyway. Um, but yes. So that is what I wanted to share about kinship terms and being a parent. And I have a few things to say about intersectional identities and I don't know, sort of thornier issues that sometimes crop up. But perhaps before I start in on that, I'll just ask again if anyone has any questions. Okay, if anything crops up, yeah, there will be a chance at the end as well. So intersectional identities. So at the beginning of this talk, I mentioned that gender and culture are very much intertwined. Um, I also mentioned that I'm a white settler with bipolar disorder. And so while I'm non-binary, I'm a bunch of other things as well. And that's true of all non-binary and trans and queer people. All of us hold a range of intersecting identities, and they influence the way we move through the world and the way we understand the world. So some non-binary people may come from cultures where there is currently and there has historically been more space for what our culture would call trans identity. And some non-binary people may come from cultures that more actively oppress or repress trans identities. I'm not going to get like too into this, but I think it is important to say that when it comes to barriers and oppression and marginalization for trans people, white masculinist trans people like myself are statistically more likely to be able to find employment and housing and be relatively safe from violence. There are still barriers and there's still marginalization, but because of our intersecting identities, it's fundamentally different than what my trans friends of color go through, in particular, Black and Indigenous trans women of color. And I think that it's important to talk about awareness in healthcare settings and schools and even LGBTQ organizations. But it's also important for me to say that I'm speaking from a particular place, and there are lots of trans experiences I can't speak to personally. There are 3 things I have shared that I would like to share with you, though. I have learned that I would like to share with you, though, and perhaps you know them already. So one is that non-binary folks often short form non-binary to NB, that's ENBY. And if you've ever wondered why it is ENBY, that's because NB has like capital N, capital B, has been used in discussions of race and racial justice for quite some time. So like in the term NBPOC or non-Black person of color. So ENBY is a neologism nickname for non-binary people that does not sort of like pave over that pre-existing history. And then the second thing, this is sort of one of the thorny things that comes up in terms of non-binary identity. So I have noticed that feminist groups who want to be inclusive of trans and non-binary people often make a similar mistake that I don't think is intentional. And so often a group that has been historically women only will decide that it's actually really important that their mandate is more inclusive than that, because they want to tackle oppressions that impact basically everyone who's not a man or cisgender man. And that's great. But what tends to happen sometimes is that the first people welcomed into that group or invited into that group are trans men and non-binary people who were assigned female at birth. And really, when it comes to non-binary identity, it shouldn't matter what gender someone was assigned at birth. But I've been in several groups where this type of thing has happened. And it was my place to say, like, hey, I think we should make sure that we're inviting trans women and non-binary femmes and making sure that that is a priority. Um, Basically, the way that we're socialized to think about gender is so ingrained that it takes a while to break out of that. So we don't want to be replicating in our justice related organizations the same kind of gender essentialism that we're trying to fight. So if you're in an organization that's trying to roll out the welcome mat, or I just encourage people to be intentional about it. Um, and then earlier, I also mentioned that non-binary people have a variety of sexual orientations, and gender is not synonymous with sexual orientation. Now that we've had a nice long talk, I'm losing my voice, so I can tell that's true. I wanted to say there is sometimes some crossover for some non-binary people. So someone might be simultaneously non-binary and butch, for example, and their butchness for them might signal a connection to lesbian culture and community that's important for them. And it doesn't negate their non-binariness to sort of retain that identification. And again, I won't go too deeply into it, but I just wanted to say it's complex and it's personal. And personally, I favor an approach to queer community that is welcoming and that allows for sort of both and approach to identity and selfhood. And that's where I'll end. And on that note, I'm going to share one more screen. And again, I can make this into a PDF, but this is just some further reading and listening. So there's a podcast called They and Us, hosted by Faith Fundel, who is a CBC, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation reporter. They made a podcast about non-binary identity. There's also Transcripts, which is another podcast which I really like, which is about trans identity more broadly. There's Beyond the Gender Binary by Alok Vaid-Bennett. It's a nonfiction book. Alok also has a really great Instagram account where they model lots of different fashions. It's fun. There's an anthology, Non-Binary, Memoirs of Gender and Identity. There's Gender Failure by Ivan Coyote and Ray Spoon. That's nonfiction. And Tomboy's Survival Guide by Ivan Coyote. Ivan and Ray and I have the same publisher in Canada that, and actually the next book too, Love After the End, an anthology of Two-Spirit and Indigenous queer speculative fiction. Those are all from Arsenal Pulp Press, which we've been lucky enough to sort of have some. The books are a little bit more familiar in the States, I would say. Anyway, I'm bringing to you a number of Canadian books because that's where I come from. And then in terms of kids' books, two books that have non-binary people in them are Bridge of Flowers by Leah Lakshmi Pyapsna Samarinsna, illustrated by Cyrus Marcus Ware. That's children's fiction. And then Meet Polka Dot, which is written and illustrated by Tallulah Broadhead. It's also children's fiction. So those last two we have in our house. We read to our kid, and we have a few more on order. Yeah. Another book that I really like is, it's not actually, it doesn't have a non-binary person in it, but Princess Puffy Bottom and Daryl is a queer book I really like for kids. And it's a story that has queer people in it. Like the story is not focused on identity, which I really like. Yes, so I'll leave that up for a bit longer if anyone wants to take notes. And then I told everyone that there would be a trivia question at the end of the talk. So actually, maybe I need to stop sharing the screen in order to do that. Is there anyone who wants me to keep it up for a minute longer? All good. Okay. So I think we'll do this in the chat. Is everyone ready? So you will win a copy of my book if you answer first. So trivia question. What is the gender neutral term for niece/nephew? Yes, Sophia Smith. Very quick. Awesome. Nibbling it is. I'm sorry to Catherine and Bree. You were also very quick. So, all right. So that is the talk I prepared to share with you all today. And at this point, I guess I would like to just if you want to ask me a question, I'd be happy to answer a question. If anyone has anything they want to share, I think probably our group is kind of small enough that it can be a comment and not a question today.
Before we go on, I am going to stop the recording now, but feel free to stay on here if you have any questions or comments. Thank you.